CCMA is the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration. Okay, so that's something that disgruntled former employees can utilize. They've made this ruling that the decision by that company, the Gold Rush Group, to dismiss the worker for refusing the COVID vaccine was justified. So does this create any sort of legal precedent? Or because it was CCMA, is it just simply case by case?
So in terms of precedent, thank you for having me. The CCMA would probably consider, in the event that there are future matters that are referred to the CCMA, and I'm sure there will be, other commissioners may consider this decision when determining what the appropriate course of action is in relation to an unfair dismissal claim in respect of an employee who refuses to vaccinate in circumstances where the employer has a mandatory vaccination policy in place. However, the CCMA is an employment tribunal. It's the first place that you go when you're an employee and you've been dismissed. There are several other courts that you can approach thereafter in the event that you are not content with the outcome at the CCMA. So in this instance, if the employee is not satisfied with the CCMA's decision, she can then refer a review application to the Labour Court. She would have to prove certain things in relation to the Commissioner's decision in order to succeed on a review application. In the event that she succeeded in a review application, the company could then choose to appeal that decision by the Labour Court to the Labour Appeal Court. And then thereafter, the losing party could go to then the Supreme Court of Appeal and then possibly to the Constitutional Court. So this may have a long way to go. The decision may stay where it is in the CCMA, and the employee may choose not to take it further. So it remains to be seen what will happen in that regard.
I think it's interesting to unpack because we do know that there are quite a few of these cases in court at the moment. So let's just dive a little bit more into the CCMA's ruling. They ultimately found that her argument, which was she had a constitutional right to bodily integrity, they ultimately found that that wasn't a strong enough argument. Do you know why?
Well, in the absence of seeing the record of proceedings and the evidence that was led and the detailed examination and cross-examination of witnesses, it's not possible to make a determination in relation to whether or not the Commissioner's decision was a reasonable one or correct on the facts and on the law. However, what appears to have occurred in this matter is that the company appears to have complied with the Consolidated Direction on Occupational Health and Safety in certain workplaces when implementing its mandatory vaccination policy. There was evidence to suggest that they consulted with the trade unions and the employees and all relevant stakeholders for a long period of time, a period of 3 months, before they implemented the policy. So that's important in terms of from a procedural perspective. Also, the direction provides that an employer must provide an opportunity for employees to apply for an exemption on the basis of constitutional grounds or medical grounds. So in this instance, it was a constitutional ground, the right to bodily integrity. But as I've indicated previously, Section 36 of the Constitution provides that certain rights in the Bill of Rights that are capable may be limited in terms of Section 36. In an open and democratic society, provided it's reasonable and justifiable. Now, there are rights that are not capable of being limited, the right to life and the right to dignity. The right to bodily integrity is a right that can be limited. And when you determine whether or not that right can be limited, you look at a series of factors, such as the purpose of the limitation, whether or not the limitation is reasonable and justifiable, the nature of the limitation, and so on, and whether or not the limitation is, how extensive it is, the scope, etc. So you conduct an analysis and then you determine whether or not the rights can be limited.
So what I'm hearing, they ruled against this staff member who didn't want the COVID vaccine around process, the procedure that the company took, and also the substantive issue, which of course was her argument that she had a right to bodily integrity in this particular case. The process, of course, is that consultation that the company did, speaking to staff, speaking to unions, and that's a key point to note. And I think particularly for companies wishing to pursue this route, bearing in mind that we're still waiting for that declaratory order that the business community wants from the courts to lay out some sort of framework as to how companies institute vaccine mandates.
Well, it's interesting because we've got a couple of cases that have been referred. One has been referred directly to the Constitutional Court and requests that the Constitutional Court make a decision in relation to this issue. And then we've also got, of course, the cases that have been brought by Solidarity, in particular the one in respect of the University of the Free State. So we've got a number of cases that are going to probably eventually land up in the Constitutional Court if, unless direct access is granted in this particular matter that I'm referring to. But yeah, we've probably got some way to go before we have finality on this. But I think that certainly insofar as the CCMA decision is concerned, it appears that on the basis of the evidence that was led, that the Commissioner's decision was probably correct in those circumstances. Of course, that's having, with the caveat that I haven't seen the record of proceedings, so I don't know what evidence was before the Commissioner. But it's also important to understand that when you so there are two processes, in fact. So there's the process in relation to the mandatory vaccination policy, implementing it, the consultation process. And then there's a process in relation to the dismissal, and that's a separate process. So when a commissioner finds that an employee was substantively and procedurally fairly dismissed, that means that the procedure followed in relation to the employee's dismissal and the reason for the dismissal were fair. So that procedure and reason would be separate from the procedure that's followed in relation to consultation. And in this instance, what happened after they had the consultations in relation to the mandatory vaccination policy, they then went through a procedure with a specific employee. And my understanding is that she raised an exemption. She applied for an exemption in terms of their mandatory vaccination policy, and they considered it and they rejected it. And then my understanding is that she appealed it and they rejected it again. So my understanding is there was quite a long process there as well in relation to her exemption application, which I think is also important, because you'll remember in terms of the consolidated direction, in the event that you've reached essentially an impasse in relation to the vaccination issue, and let's say the employee doesn't have a valid reason for refusing to vaccinate in circumstances where there's a policy in place, then you have to look at reasonable accommodation and whether or not the employee can be reasonably accommodated. And employers are obliged to determine that, but they're not required to undergo unjustifiable hardship in relation to that reasonable accommodation. So that also depends on the
Yeah. Okay. Well, you've explained it so well, and thank you so much, because it really is quite a long road. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of different routes that an employee can take, and lots of court cases on the go on this particular issue. Thank you so much, Jacqui Reed, Senior Associate at Herbert Smith Freehills.